Hi everyone and welcome to today's Queensland Lunch and Learn legislation webinar, scheme termination and regulation amendments. Today we've got Jessica Cannon and Duncan Lee presenting. So thanks very much guys and welcome back. My name's Angela from the Learning and Development team at SCAQ, and I'll begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Yirragera country on which we're hosting this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So thanks very much everyone for attending. I'll just take a second and I will thank our sponsors. So thank you very much Macquarie Bank, BCB, Strata Max, Tobmans, all together, Grace Lawyers, Strata Community Insurance, Hum Energy, Express Glass, Bill Check, Productive, and Container Exchange. So thanks very much. The support's not only enhanced our educational initiatives, but you also play a vital role in fostering a stronger, more knowledgeable community. So thanks very much for making a significant impact on the journey of education within Strata. So quick housekeeping, if anyone's joined us today and haven't yet registered, just send us an email and we can get you registered so you can get your CPD points. You need to do that within 7 days. So if you can get that in within 7 days, you can get your half a point for joining us today. If you've got any questions, please use the Q&A facility, which should be on your menu bar, and pop questions in for Jess and Duncan to answer. And there'll be a little bit of time at the end, hopefully, to answer any questions. So thanks again, and without further ado, what I'm going to do is just pass you over to Duncan. I will mute my screen and let Duncan go through his slides in 1 second.
All right, we've jumped significantly ahead. So let's see if we can go back again, the joys of online webinars. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be covering mainly the scheme termination and the layered arrangements for the amendments to the legislation, but we'll be briefly touching on a couple things with pets today because just recently some announcements came out about the changes to the regulation modules attached to the amendments to the legislation that will come to force, which just tweaked some of the requirements for minutes for pets especially. So we can move on to that with Jess.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, look, it's always the joys of Strata, isn't it? You need to be able to think on your feet and pivot because often no day is ever the same. And when these were announced on Friday, we thought we would seize the opportunity of having you all online today to be able to go through the amendments. So these amendments in particular that we're about to cover off on are actually amendments to the regulation module, or modules, I should say. And what they're really looking at doing is acknowledging the amendments to the Act that we've spoken about at length, and Duncan and I did a webinar on that last week. But what does that mean in terms of practicalities and formalities? As we all know, they're where your regulation modules come into play. So obviously those modules have been slightly tweaked, and there is some new things in there that we thought would be very prudent to make you all aware of. So two big amendments we're going to focus on today is pet approvals and the formalities on that side, but also some fees and layered arrangements and access to body corporate records too. So first and foremost, for pet approvals, the amendments, and to be clear, these amendments take effect from 1 May as well. So exactly the same commencement date as the amendments to the Act too. But for pet approvals, the amendments have now reflected that the body corporate or its committee, and I'll break that down in a minute, Duncan, has to, within 21 days from receiving a request, decide whether to grant written approval to keep an animal on the lot and or the common property. So this is a bit of a difference to your lot owner submitted motions, which ordinarily have your 6-week provisions on it. That these amendments are really looking at making sure that a body corporate or its committee on receipt of a PET application is ultimately tabling that PET approval and making a decision, meaning in my view, a written minuted resolution of the body corporate within 21 days of receipt. Now, I did make note that it's a minuted resolution. So my view is that's either at a formal committee meeting, if that's what the committee chooses to do so, or it just so happen to have a committee meeting already scheduled, or it would be via a flying minute, aka a vote outside of committee meeting as well. The importance is the committee has a minuted resolution at the end of that 21 days. Now, the other really interesting amendment, Duncan, that we see in here is that the regulation modules have actually amended the definition of full and accurate minutes. There's almost been like a carve out or exemption made to that definition. And what they're looking at doing is saying in circumstances where a body corporate is approving a pet or an animal to be kept on the lot, then full and accurate minutes have certain aspects or information that needs to be included. So what needs to be included in that minuted resolution is the day in which the request was made to the committee. So a date referenced, if known, any details of the animal subject to the approval, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Any conditions imposed by the committee on the approval, and also needs to note whether the animal was subject to a deemed decision, which again I'll get to in a minute, or whether it was just by way of a standard vote. Now, the details of the animal, again, there's specification built into these amendments. We're looking at the animal species, if known, the breed of the animal's sex, and the animal's names as well. So it's interesting on that part that ultimately those minutes need to be more wholesome in terms of what they need to reflect for the pet owner in approval being given. The body corporate or its committee, if the body corporate or its committee doesn't make a decision within that 21 days, then there is a deemed decision being made. So these amendments are acknowledging the fact that sometimes voting doesn't occur, or you have an insufficient quorum, whatever the case may be. If a decision of the committee is not made within the 21 days, then there's a deemed decision made on behalf of that body corporate as well. So that again it needs to be reflected in the minuted resolution that's passed. If the decision to approve pets or animals in a scheme is a restricted issue, or it needs to be progressed to a general meeting, then there's also provision built into these amendments as well. Generally speaking, what that looks like is that the committee has 21 days from the date in which the request was made or received to call a general meeting. And obviously a general meeting is called by notice being circulated to owners. So again, there's that specificity built into these amendments around how these timeframes are going to be applied. The body corporate also has an obligation, and it seems so obvious, but again, I guess to clear out any grey, there's an obligation to place the pet approval application or request as a motion on the agenda for that meeting, and also an obligation on the body corporate to convene the general meeting within 6 weeks. So again, there's some really clear understanding about the timeframes that are going to be applied to pet approvals moving forward. If the motion is passed, notification must be provided to the requesting party, normally the pet owner, as soon as practicable after the general meeting. And again, that applies for committee resolutions as well, Duncan. So ordinarily, you would all have 21 days to get your minutes out there. These amendments haven't put a shorter time frame on that obligation, but have said, a strong encouragement for that to be shorter, in my view, and as soon as practicably possible means anywhere less than 21 days, but as soon as practically possible, that requesting party needs to be notified of that minuted resolution.
Yeah. And I think with all of that additional information, what stood out to me in terms of what isn't defined is what is a request. It's not defined in terms of any of the documentation here, and in my mind, it really puts more weight on bodies corporate having their bylaws reviewed in light of these amendments.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, because it'll be advantageous to define a request in that bylaw. What constitutes a request for a pet? Does a request need to have a copy of the registration, copy of vaccination details, all those things? Because it's really important to identify when that 21-day clock starts ticking.
Look, and you and I were in our preparation for this webinar, Duncan, talking about assignments of management rights.
Yep.
That's another circumstance where it's put usually to the committee to make a decision. As we all are aware, legislation provides that the time starts when the body corporate has all reasonably necessary material to consider it. These amendments don't factor in that level of, I guess, flexibility in the time frame that's given. So it is very important to make sure for you all to check your portfolios, have a look at the bylaws that are there, and make sure that you have quite a wholesome pet bylaw, animal bylaw in place, and flesh out what is a proper request, as Duncan says. What is it that the committee wants to see? Because there isn't as great a flexibility as, say, an assignment of management rights at what we will see here. And the risk is that time will start, and you don't want that time to start on a one-sentence application when there's so much more information that is needed to reasonably consider. The other important point before we wrap up this slide, and I know there's a lot of information in here, so again, if we do have time to flesh out some questions, we will by all means do so. We'll also keep working in the background with our member resource team to see what we can bring out in terms of some practical tools for you all. But when dealing with a general meeting motion to approve a pet, a deemed decision will occur if the general meeting is not called within the 21 days or the body corporate does not make a decision within the prescribed period, being the 6 weeks of that general meeting as well. So it's important here to say that if no action is taken by the body corporate or the committee, there is provision and there is, I guess, a protection given to the pet owner that a decision will be made within those timeframes. I think a lot of this comes down to trying to see the body corporate legislation work better with your tenancies legislation as well. Timeframes are not going to be the same, but they're trying to bring it into line a little bit more on that front as well. I don't have control, Duncan, but if you wouldn't mind flicking over to your next slide, that would be great.
There we go.
So a couple of things just before we wrap up the pet approval, everybody, is that these provisions will only apply if there is a pet bylaw in place, which requires pet approval to be obtained prior to bringing that pet on the lot. So again, this is the importance of making sure that you're reviewing your portfolios, getting a good understanding of what each scheme's regulations and rules are in terms of pets, and then turning your mind to whether these provisions will ultimately apply to those schemes or not. We fleshed this out in a little bit of detail, but the obligation to notify the requesting party as soon as practically after a decision is made as well. That I think is not your 21 days, that's sooner than your 21 days. So again, that's probably going to fall back on you all as the people that often produce these minutes in trying to get them out as soon as possible to that requesting party. Just so if there's a contract of sale or a lease that's subject to pet approval being given, then we can see that approval being communicated in an efficient time frame. Sorry, Duncan, did you have something to say there?
No, it was all good. You covered all the bases there. Very good. Okay, and if we're finished on the pets thing, and sorry, just for Angela, just for reference for later on. I can't see any of the Q&As that are coming up, so we might need to have access to those at the end, because there may be some coming through from the pets. But we can move on to layer arrangements and fees. This is really coming down to the searches for the body corporate records, and how owners go about accessing that information in terms of searches. Now, one thing to really keep an eye out for in the way that the fees are set out now is that they do prescribe a fee unit, and a fee unit is not equal to $1. It started out as $1, now it's $1.06. So the fee isn't directly equivalent to the fee unit. So before we go into those calculations, Jess, is there anything in particular here that you think is out of the ordinary, or do you think this is just a common sense approach to allow owners in a layered structure to have access to the principal and other body corporate records?
Yeah, look, I think most of it is already in practice, Duncan. What these amendments more so do is look at removing, in my view, that grey in terms of how the records can be given. So as we've noted on the slides there, it's reflecting that they can still be given by post, they can still be given personally, but there is also scope if an agreement is reached between the requesting party and the body corporate for the records to be given via other means, i.e. a Dropbox if it's quite a heavy bundle of documents or the like. So look, again, I think it's already there in practice. A lot of people are already doing it. What these amendments are looking at doing is removing that grey and going, yep, this is 2024. We should be reflecting where our technology allows for documents to be given between the parties.
Yep, very good. And I did my best to calculate the fees based on the information provided. There is a rounding component that comes into these fees when you're using the released fee unit price, but when I did the research, again, double checking this morning, it came up with a site that could not be reached. So if I have made any errors in those calculations, I do apologize in advance. I just couldn't double check today.
It's never ideal when that happens, Duncan.
Yeah. I think there was a typo in the link, so hopefully that'll be rectified in the next few days.
Nice. And look, just before we wrap up those amendments to the regulation modules, like I said, they only came out, or we were only notified of them on Friday. So please bear with us. We will try and produce some more member resources for you all. We'll probably keep using our 6-pack and the like to educate you as much as possible in terms of any further amendments or the like that we think you should be aware of. But on to the bigger ticket item of why we were having today's webinar, which is the scheme termination. So again, this is an amendment that came through in the round of amendments to the Body Corporate and Community Management Act. And what it is essentially doing is exactly what we spoke about back in November, I think it was, Duncan. In terms of giving bodies corporate a third avenue to dissolve its scheme. So it's really important here, everyone, to consider and remember that the other two existing avenues still exist. I.e. a scheme can be dissolved by way of a resolution without dissent. It can also be dissolved by an order of the court, but there is this new process that's available, which is very reliant on economic reasons. So in circumstances where a number of steps are taken, I'll get to that in a minute, and there are economic reasons warranting a scheme to be terminated, then it can do so on a 75% vote of the ownership to be able to do it. Now, we have been working on a flow chart, which you would have seen a draft copy back in November. We're working with other stakeholders and the like in terms of refining that to make sure that it is as simple as we can possibly make it, because this is a process, and it is important to remember that there's a lot that would go into a scheme being terminated. But very broadly speaking, and a high over, and just to recap in case you are fielding questions on scheme terminations, The first step is a pre-termination plan. It's ultimately going to be a report that's going to be produced on behalf of the body corporate by a qualified person. There could also be the involvement of structural engineers, quantity surveyors and the likes in these reports as well. It will look at going through market valuations. It will look at going through what are we saying the economic reasons are that would warrant us commencing this process, because this plan is the first step off the rank in a nutshell. It's then going to go to an economic reasons resolution, and you'll see this on the next slide that Duncan will go through. There's about there is 3 general meeting resolutions that are needed in this process. The first 2 are by way of a majority resolution, and the third resolution, which is the actual termination, is your 75% vote. But your economic reasons resolution is the motion that gets put to owners for owners to say, yeah, we think that report is pretty accurate in terms of the current condition of our scheme. Yes, we agree that there are, very significant structural issues, and the economic viability of the scheme isn't sufficient to carry it on for the future, whatever the case may be. The third test is if that economic reasons resolution is resolved, then you proceed to the termination plan resolution, and this then is your termination plan. So the nuts and bolts of what this is going to look like money in people's pocket is going to be a very big element of this. If their scheme is terminated and they own a lot, what type of money are they going to receive to be compensated for that? And are they going to be able to get back into the current market, knowing how, I guess difficult that is in Queensland with the housing crisis at the moment. So that termination plan is the nuts and bolts of what's going to be looked at. It also brings in other interested parties, which you'll remember us talking about back in November. So we're looking at lessees in this situation as well. We're probably going to be looking at mortgagees as well in this position. We're going to be looking at long-term service contractors, other people that perhaps don't have property rights within the scheme, but have other rights, other interests within the scheme that are going to receive some form of detriment if this scheme is ultimately terminated. Now, assuming that all of those things still tick up, then your final step is your termination resolution, which is your 75% of owners' votes in favour of terminating. So I guess the high level overview of this, everybody, is that it is a long process. And as Duncan will touch on in the next slide, there's a number of steps that are going to need to be ticked off. There's going to be a number of resolutions that's going to be needed, and it's not going to be this streamline, the majority outweighs the minority situation as well. I'll pass it over to you, Duncan, to flesh out that a little bit more.
No worries, thanks, Jess. And the more I think about this, I think that for body corporate managers, our role in this isn't necessarily knowing all of the nitty-gritty of going through. The first step in this is communicating with the committees and the interested parties about whether this is even worthwhile, about what support they have for terminating the scheme, what appetite and options they have available to them. As you pointed out, Jess, if the scheme is terminated, what are your options? Where are you going to go? Because this is not going to be a cheap exercise. This is going to be an expensive, drawn-out exercise. And let's say hypothetically, when you ask the question, what is the support? If they believe that they've got 100% support in terminating the scheme, then go down the resolution without dissent path. That's the surest way of getting a resolution to this, getting to the end goal. Probably one other thing that's worth looking at too, reiterating too, with the economic reasons resolution. Nothing in the economics reasons resolution can relate to the value of the land. So if you have a large parcel of land with a 6-pack on it and the value of the land exceeds the aggregate value of all the lots included in the scheme, then that's not sufficient for an economic reason for terminating the scheme. The economic reasons need to be about the body corporate meeting its obligations about repairs and maintenance. So if it's a well-maintained building but on a valuable parcel of land, it will not pass this test, or unlikely to pass this test, because we haven't actually tested these tests yet. But with that in mind, we do have a number of these, a number of items to cover here. So we do have the two primary reports to be undertaken. They're the pre-termination report and the termination report, and these fall into those categories that Jess covered earlier with the appropriate resolutions. There'll be a number of resolutions that we need to go through. The first one being the economic resolutions passed by a majority resolution. Termination plan resolution passed by a majority resolution. So those resolutions are the resolutions to set the wheels in motion to obtain those reports. And then once you have that termination plan report, you have a third general meeting to pass the termination resolution, where it needs to be 75% of owners must vote in favour of the motion. And there's different triggers for notification along the way. There's different triggers where notification needs to be given to all the occupiers of lots, all the service contractors. And again, we won't spend a lot of time going through those, seeing as we've got 4 minutes left in our half an hour. But these are all things that need to be fleshed out along the journey. It'll be a long, drawn-out process, as I said, and primarily, I think it's imperative that we work with the committees to ensure that they understand what they're undertaking if they do want to go down this path. That it will be a long, drawn-out process. And just again, I'm skipping over a few things here, but is there anything that you think is the most vital takeaway or vital thing for our members to communicate to committees if they're asking about this process? What should be the first question that's asked?
Look, I think you hit the nail on the head in our preparation, Duncan, and that's understanding the appetite that owners have to go down this process. Because in my mind, it's one of desire and want to terminate a scheme, but it's a very different scenario once you start looking at the financial input that you're going to need and investment that you're going to need to actually start this process. Now, I don't know what those pre-termination plans and termination plans are going to look like, especially how much they're going to cost. But I could imagine that they're going to be very in-depth plans that they're going to need to be undertaken by at least one, if not three, different individuals in terms of their qualifications, their knowledge, and their experience. So it's not going to be a cheap exercise to start this process. So I think one of a desire, but that desire to be a realistic desire that owners are willing to put their hands in their pockets to start contributing to explore this avenue, because that's very much what it is. You're exploring it and you're really not going to know whether it's going to be a feasible option for your scheme until about 2/3 of the way through, in my view. Now, on top of that, committees need to be aware and educated that there are dispute resolution avenues throughout this process too, actually. The first one is through a specialist adjudication, which should be a pretty streamlined process. The second avenue is through a court of competent jurisdiction. So again, just because you have an overwhelming majority, and committees might think, yep, I'll easily get the 75%. That doesn't mean that the minority in there won't have any say or voice in terms of this process going through as well. So it is important to know that once you start it, you have that investment, that financial component to it, but also there may be a level of legal action taken in certain parts to challenge the decisions being made. And again, different people can do that at different times and the like. The flow chart will canvass all of that, but it's important for committees to be aware that it's not going to be a streamlined process once it starts as well.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that if we can take anything from other jurisdictions, these amendments are really going to be a catalyst to bringing people to the negotiating table rather than a mechanism to terminate a scheme. I think that's something that's come through from loud and clear from New South Wales, that while they've got these provisions in place, from my recollection, I don't believe they've actually been enacted at all. It's just been a catalyst to bring people together to actually agree to termination.
That's my understanding as well. I think that there's very, very few in New South Wales that have actually seen this process through, because the process is quite burdensome. Often it's more likely that a negotiation will occur, knowing that the worst case scenario is the body corporate has to go this cost to be able to see through this type of termination avenue as well.
Very good. And we do have one question on this. A question is 75% of owners or 75% of unit entitlements?
75% of owners is my understanding on that one, Frank. I can't recall the specific provision off the top of my head, but I did just double check the flow chart in its draft form, and 75% or more owners must vote in favour of the motion in order for it to be carried. So one lot, one vote.
Yep, that's my recollection too. I'm 75% sure of that. Okay, so we're right on 12:31. So did we have any other questions? There's no others that are coming through on the Q&A sheet.
Perfect.
We've got one coming through from Scott Painter. Assuming the scheme is being sold to a developer, what are the next steps once all the resolutions have been carried? Good question, Scott. I might jump in then, Jess.
Sure.
My feeling on this is exactly what I was saying before, that I think this is going to be a catalyst to bring people together to the negotiating table rather than a mechanism to terminate a scheme, because when the lots are being sold to a developer, once they have all the lots, they'll just pass that resolution without dissent and terminate the scheme. Yeah. Just your thoughts?
Look, I agree. I think it depends on the way in which it's ultimately going to be structured. But my view is that normally if it's one entity that's purchasing all the lots, once they hold the title to all of those lots, then they can just pass the resolution without dissent that they need under the existing processes. So this current process that we're looking at, Scott, for economic reasons, probably wouldn't apply. You wouldn't go down that path.
Very good. Frank's asked a question, can a poll be requested? And again, my gut feeling is that the answer is no, because it's based on lots, not entitlements.
Yeah. That's my recollection as well. Frank, I'm happy to double check that just to make sure, but I am with Duncan. I understood that it was always going to be a situation of one lot, one vote. It's very much based on ownership, not entitlements.
And Mahi Singh's asked an interesting question. Also, what happens to the sinking fund and admin fund in the bank account if the whole property is sold to the government? Does it get distributed between the body corporate members? Now, I would have thought that if it's being sold to the government, by the time the scheme's terminated, the government constitutes all of the members of the body corporate, and that's where it goes to at the end. I've had similar situations with schemes that have been where a developer ultimately owns all of the lots in the scheme, and they just collect the funds at the end of the day.
Yep, look, I agree. If we were dealing with the new scheme termination process, the economic reasons one, my view would be that would be something that would be considered in your pre-termination plan and perhaps your termination plan as well. That's the nuts and bolts of saying, well, if we have a huge amount of surplus money sitting in the sinking fund, that's an asset that's owned by the body corporate, in turn the lot owners. So how are we proposing to deal with that asset? And it's not just confined to monetary bank accounts either. If you have big schemes that own a lot of machinery, caretaking works or the like, again, they're all assets. So that termination plan very much looks at a statement of assets and liabilities. What is it that we can sell that's not attached to the land? What is it that our liabilities are? And it works out what the nuts and bolts of that distribution will be if a termination plan resolution is passed as well. All right, we'll pass it back over to you, Angela.
Great, thanks very much, Jess and Duncan. Thank you, that was great. And thanks for everybody that put questions in. If there is anything else that you need to ask, you can just pop that through to education. So just send an email to education.qld@strata.community, and we can pass the questions on to Duncan and Jess. So thanks very much, guys, and thanks for everyone for joining us.